You did everything right. You showed up every single day. You were consistent. You were loyal. You put in the work that most men won't even attempt. You communicated. You stayed. You built something real. And she still left. Not because you failed her, not because you weren't enough, but because somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet voice started whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was something better out there. Someone better. A version of life that felt more exciting, more electric, more aligned with whatever image she had constructed in her head. So she went looking for it. And here's the part that nobody ever wants to talk about. Months later, sometimes a year later, sometimes longer, she comes back. Not with the same fire, not with the same certainty she had when she walked out, but she comes back. And most men don't know what to do with that, because they never understood what caused it in the first place. So let's talk about it. Let's go deep into the actual psychology of why this happens. Not the surface level explanation, not the emotional version that makes everyone feel better. The real one. The one that explains the pattern, the return, and everything in between. The first thing you need to understand is that this has almost nothing to do with emotions. Most people think it does. Most people frame this entire conversation around feelings. She felt this. She needed that. She wanted more of something else. And while emotions are involved, they are not the engine. They are the symptom. The engine is perception. Because better is almost never an objective measurement. It is not calculated. It is not rational. It is constructed. It is relative. It is shaped by environment, by comparison, by external validation, and by society's constant stream of information telling someone that more is available, that options are endless, and that settling is a mistake. Think about what that does to a person's decision-making. When the world around you constantly signals abundance, when every platform, every social interaction, every piece of content is designed to make you feel like there is always something more, your perception of what you already have starts to erode. Not because it lost value, but because it no longer feels scarce. And when something stops feeling scarce, the mind starts to categorize it as replaceable. That is the trap. And most people walk straight into it without ever realizing what happened. Here is the hidden principle that governs almost all of this. People do not leave for better realities. They leave for better perceptions. Read that again. Because it changes everything. Perception is immediate. It is visceral. It hits you in a second and it feels completely real, completely valid, completely justified. Reality, on the other hand, takes time. Reality requires experience. Reality reveals itself slowly through repetition, through exposure, through the accumulation of actual lived moments. And because perception is so much faster than reality, decisions get made before reality even has a chance to show up. She didn't leave because she found something objectively better. She left because something felt better. In that window of time, in that emotional state, with that particular level of external noise amplifying everything around her, the feeling was real. The comparison felt accurate. The conclusion felt logical. And that is exactly where the miscalculation begins. Now let's go a level deeper. Because to really understand this, you have to understand something about the way the human mind actually operates. We are wired to compare. Constantly. Relentlessly. Not because we are broken or superficial, but because comparison is one of the most fundamental tools the brain uses to evaluate the world. Value, status, risk, opportunity. All of it gets processed through comparison. That is not a flaw. That is architecture. But here is where modern life creates a serious problem. For most of human history, comparison was limited. You compared yourself and your circumstances to what was immediately available. The people in your village. The options in your environment. The reality directly in front of you. That created natural boundaries. Natural constraints. And those constraints actually served a protective function. They kept perception grounded. Today, those constraints are gone. Social media alone has dismantled the entire framework. Now, comparison is infinite. Now, someone can sit in a relationship that is genuinely good, genuinely stable, genuinely worth holding on to. And in the span of 30 minutes of scrolling, their perception of that relationship will shift, because they are no longer comparing to what is real. They are comparing to what is curated, to what is performed, to what is selectively presented, with perfect lighting, perfect framing, and zero accountability for accuracy. And the brain cannot tell the difference. The same neural circuits that evolved to process real-world comparison are now processing manufactured images, and they respond identically. The result is a completely distorted sense of what is available, what is normal, and what is possible. That distortion is not innocent. It has consequences, real ones. This brings us to the first rule, and this one is foundational. The more options someone believes they have, the less they value what they currently have. Not because what they have is lacking, not because the relationship is broken, but purely because the mind has shifted its frame of reference. Scarcity creates value. That is not a theory. That is one of the most well-documented principles in behavioral psychology, in economics, and human decision-making across every culture and every era. When something feels rare, the mind assigns it weight. It treats it carefully. It protects it. When something feels abundant, the mind relaxes its grip. It becomes less careful, less protective, because somewhere underneath the conscious decision-making, the assumption takes hold that if this one disappears, another one will appear. That loss is recoverable. That replacement is easy. That assumption is almost always wrong, but it feels right in the moment. And feelings in the moment are incredibly powerful. So what happens in practice? She is in a good relationship. She knows it is good on some level, but her environment is feeding her a constant signal that options are everywhere. Attention is everywhere. Interest is everywhere. And that signal over time starts to corrode the perceived scarcity of what she has. It starts to whisper that what she has is common, that it is replaceable, that she could find it again or find something better without much difficulty. That is where the idea of, quote, one is born, not in a moment of genuine dissatisfaction, but in a slow erosion of perceived scarcity. Now layer the second rule on top of that. Validation distorts perception. This one is subtle, but it might be the most powerful mechanism in the entire pattern. Because validation does something very specific to the human psyche. It inflates self-assessment, and when self-assessment inflates, expectations inflate with it. Think about what consistent external validation actually communicates to the brain. Every compliment says, you are highly desirable. Every reaction says, you have significant market value. Every message from someone new says, you have access, you have options, you could do better. None of those messages are neutral. They are all calibrating something. They are adjusting the internal benchmark against which everything else gets measured. So when someone is receiving a high volume of external validation, their perception of their own value rises. That is natural. That is expected. But the problem is that their expectations rise with it. And now the relationship they are in, the partner they have, the reality they are living, all of it gets measured against this inflated benchmark. And the gap between what they have and what they now believe they deserve starts to grow, not because the relationship got worse, but because the benchmark got higher. Artificially, temporarily, without any real-world foundation, but real enough to change how everything feels. Here's what happens next. And this is where the third rule comes in. Short-term emotion overrides long-term value every single time. When something new enters the picture, when someone new appears and introduces excitement and novelty and unpredictability, the brain responds to that with an intensity that feels indistinguishable from meaning. Excitement feels important. Novelty feels significant. The uncertainty of something new generates a level of emotional engagement that stability simply cannot produce. Because stability, by definition, does not generate spikes. That is its entire purpose. Stability is the flat line that keeps everything functioning. And flat lines do not feel exciting. They feel comfortable. They feel safe. But the brain does not always reward safe. The brain rewards stimulation. And so in the comparison between the stable partner who has been consistent for years and the new person who introduces novelty and excitement and the thrill of something unknown, the new person wins the emotional vote. Almost every time, even when the new person offers objectively less, even when the new person cannot come close to matching the depth, the consistency, the investment that already existed, the feeling is stronger. And in the moment, feeling stronger is the same as being better. That is not a female problem. That is not a character flaw. That is human neurology operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The problem is that most people do not recognize it as a temporary neurological state. They experience it as a genuine revelation, as clarity, as finally seeing something they had missed. And that is where the mistake gets made. Now look at the contrast, because this is important. On one side you have stability, predictable, reliable, consistent, everything you were promised a good relationship would look like. On the other side, you have excitement, unpredictable, intense, uncertain, everything that feels electric in the short term. And here's the brutal truth about how the brain processes those two things in direct comparison. Uncertainty feels intense, and intensity is consistently mistaken for value. When you cannot predict what someone will do next, when outcomes feel uncertain, when the relationship has an element of risk, the brain pays attention. It stays engaged. It assigns weight. Because uncertainty triggers the same neural response as genuine importance. The body cannot tell the difference between intensity that comes from something that matters and intensity that comes from something that is simply unpredictable. So stability starts to read as boring, not because it is worthless, but because it is not generating the spikes that the brain has come to associate with value. And excitement starts to read as desirable, not because it offers anything sustainable, but because it generates the feeling that the brain craves. That is the trap. That is the exact mechanism that makes the idea of quote 2 feel so convincing even when the reality is so much less. But here's where things start to shift, because reality, as slow as it is, always arrives. Perception can move faster than truth, but it cannot outrun it forever. Eventually, comparison meets experience. And with eventually, what looked better has to actually be better, and that is where the illusion starts to crack. The excitement fades. It always fades. That is not pessimism. That is neuroscience. The novelty window closes. The spike of uncertainty becomes the weight of instability. The electric feeling that felt so much more intense than what she had starts to feel exhausting rather than exciting. And in that space, something shifts. The comparison she made starts to look different. The benchmark she used starts to feel distorted. And the thing she left, the stability she categorized as boring, the partner she filed under replaceable, starts to reveal its actual value. Not because anything changed in what was left behind, but because she is now experiencing the reality on the other side of the comparison. And reality is a very effective teacher. This connects directly to the fourth rule. Having options does not mean accessing better outcomes. This is one of the most misunderstood principles in the entire conversation about modern relationships. People confuse the presence of options with the availability of improvement. They are not the same thing. Attention is not commitment. Someone can give you endless attention and zero investment. Those are completely different things. Interest is not depth. Someone can find you fascinating in the window of novelty and be completely unequipped to offer anything beyond that window. Possibility is not reality. The version of something that exists in imagination, the version that is built on projection and perception before experience fills in the actual details, is almost always better than the thing itself. And this is where most of the miscalculations happen. The comparison is not being made between two real things. It is being made between one real thing and one imagined thing, between the person who is fully known, with all their ordinary dimensions and their consistent patterns, and the person who exists primarily as a projection, as potential, as possibility. Possibility always wins that comparison, because possibility has no flaws yet. It has not been tested. It has not been lived with. It has not had its bad days and its ordinary moments and its unavoidable limitations. So the decision gets made, the leap gets taken, and then reality fills in the gaps. Now let's talk about the fifth rule, because over time something inevitable happens. The market corrects itself. Perception is not permanent. It adjusts. What once felt abundant starts to feel limited once you're actually navigating it. The endless options that look so available from the outside look very different when you're trying to actually access them. When you're trying to build something real within them. When you discover that most of what appeared to be depth was performance, and most of what appeared to be better was just different. Expectations recalibrate. They have to, because reality keeps providing feedback whether you want it to or not. And as expectations come back down to something closer to accurate, something interesting happens. The past gets re-examined. The thing that was left gets re-evaluated with new data, with corrected perception, with the kind of clarity that only comes from experience on the other side. And suddenly what was labeled as not enough starts to look like exactly enough. What was categorized as too predictable starts to look like rare. What was dismissed as ordinary starts to register as exceptional. Because the benchmark shifted, and this time it shifted toward reality. This is the behavioral loop that explains almost every return story you have ever heard. It starts with departure. She leaves or pulls back or ends it, believing she is moving towards something better. The perception is real to her. The feeling is genuine. This is not a manipulation. This is not a game. This is someone acting on the information available to them in that moment, filtered through distorted perception and inflated expectations. Then comes the experience. She lives in the reality she chose. And reality does what reality always does. It fills in everything that perception left blank, and not all of it looks the way it did from the outside. Then comes reevaluation. The comparison starts to run in the other direction. The past gets measured against present experience, rather than against future projection. And the results of that comparison are very different. And then, in many cases, comes the return. But here's what you need to understand about that return. It's not the same as the departure. The departure was driven by desire, by excitement, by the pull of something that felt better. The return is driven by realization, by clarity, by an honest accounting of what was actually there and what was actually lost. Those are fundamentally different energies, and they require fundamentally different responses, because when she comes back, the dynamic has changed, and if you do not understand how it has changed, you will handle it wrong. You will respond with the same emotional framework you had before she left, and that will be a mistake. Here is what actually shifted. Before she left, you were uncertain. You were the known quantity trying to compete against the perceived unknown. You were stability competing against the fantasy of excitement. In that comparison, you were always at a disadvantage, because you were real and the competition was imaginary. When she comes back, that equation has reversed. Now you are not competing against a fantasy. Now you are being compared to an experience, to something she actually lived through. And in that comparison, your value is now visible in a way it never was when you were simply present. She knows what she had. She knows what she chose instead. And she knows which one she is standing in front of right now. That is leverage. Not leverage to be used cruelly. Not leverage to punish. But leverage that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. Because you are no longer the uncertain option. You are the known one. And after she's navigated the uncertainty she chose, known starts to feel like the most valuable thing available. But here's the paradox at the center of all of this. Value is almost never visible until it is gone. This is not a relationship insight. This is a fundamental feature of how human perception processes presence versus absence. When something is present, consistently present, reliably present, the mind stops registering it as exceptional. Comfort is the enemy of appreciation, because comfort removes friction. And without friction, the mind stops tracking importance. You show up every day. You are consistent. You are reliable. And somewhere in that consistency, your presence becomes invisible. Not because you lost value, but because presence creates familiarity. And familiarity without deliberate attention collapses into the background. Only absence creates contrast. Only loss restores visibility. And by the time absence reveals what was there, the departure has already happened. The decision has already been made. And the cost of that clarity has already been paid. That is the fundamental tragedy in this entire pattern. The value was always there. It was just invisible to someone who had never experienced its absence. Now this is critical, and it is the sixth rule, so stay with this. Stay. Most people do not leave for better. They leave for different. This is one of the most important distinctions in this entire conversation, because different and better are not the same thing. They feel the same in the moment of comparison. The novelty, the contrast, the way something unfamiliar creates a sense of expansion and possibility, all of that produces the same emotional signal that genuine improvement would produce. But different is not directional. Different does not mean higher. Different means changed, and change by itself carries no inherent value. Someone who is bored will mistake different for better because different breaks the pattern that boredom has made unbearable. Someone whose perception has been inflated by external validation will mistake different for better because different matches the elevated benchmark they have been operating from. But once the novelty of different fades, and it always fades, what remains is simply another reality. Another set of ordinary moments, another set of limitations, another person who wakes up on bad days and brings their unresolved patterns into every interaction. Different, not better. And once that distinction becomes clear through experience rather than through explanation, the mind goes looking for the thing that different was being compared to, and it finds it in what was left behind. Let's separate two concepts now, because most people blur them together, and that blurring creates enormous confusion. Attraction and stability are not the same thing. They do not operate on the same timeline. They do not serve the same function. And the mistake of treating them as interchangeable is one of the most consistent sources of poor decision-making in relationships. Attraction is immediate. It is emotional. It is unpredictable. It is driven by novelty, by chemistry, by the electrical charge of something unknown. And attraction is genuinely important. It is not superficial. It is not irrelevant, but it is temporary in its intense form. It was never designed to sustain itself at that level indefinitely. That is not a failure. That is how it works. Stability is different in every dimension. It is consistent. It is reliable. It is built over time through repeated choices, through demonstrated character, through the accumulation of real experience with another person. Stability is not exciting, but stability is rare, genuinely rare. In a landscape where almost everyone is performing, where almost everyone's presentation is curated and managed and optimized for impression. Someone who is simply and consistently real is extraordinarily uncommon. Most people spend years chasing attraction. They chase the feeling, they chase the spike, and they walk past stability without recognizing it, because stability does not announce itself the way attraction does until they lose it. And then they understand the difference in a way no explanation could have provided. And this brings us to the final rule, the one that ties everything together. Perception is fast, reality is slow, and the gap between them is where every mistake in this pattern lives. People make decisions based on what feels true, not what is true, not what experience has verified, not what time has tested. What feels true right now in this emotional state, with this information, filtered through this particular level of external noise and internal expectation. And because perception moves faster than reality, they act before reality has a chance to correct the picture, they make the comparison before both sides of the comparison are available, they assign a value before a value has been tested, they make the leap before they know what the landing looks like, and then reality arrives, slowly, patiently, completely. And it shows them exactly what their perception missed. So here's what all of this actually means. When someone believes they can do better, they're almost never pursuing a verified truth. They are pursuing a feeling, a perception, a construction built from inflated expectations, external validation, manufactured abundance, and the neurological seduction of novelty. That perception is unstable. It always has been. It will shift. It will correct itself. It will eventually run into the wall of actual lived experience, and it will have to recalibrate. And when it does, they look back. Not because you changed. You did not change. You were exactly what you always were. They look back because they changed. Their perception changed. Their expectations recalibrated. Their experience on the other side of the comparison filled in everything that projection left blank. So what does that mean for you? Do not compete with perception. You cannot win that competition because you are real and perception is imaginary. You cannot outperform a fantasy. You cannot be more exciting than novelty. You cannot make stability feel like electricity to someone who has not yet learned the value of what they are giving up. Do not chase validation. Do not try to prove your worth to someone who cannot currently see it, because the inability to see it is not a verdict on your value. It is a limitation of their current perception. And perception changes. Your only real job is to be exactly what you are, consistently, without performance, without apology, without inflating yourself for someone else's comparison or deflating yourself because someone else's perception temporarily failed to register what was there. Because in the end, people do not always leave for something better, but they almost always come back when they finally understand what they lost. And whether you are still there when that happens, that is entirely your decision to make.